Okay, so for those who have your 70 Faces book right in front of you, we're doing chapter 22, which is do not read it that way, read it this way. Now, this is one of the most used methods in the whole Gemara. This idea of where the sages will take a word or a part of a verse, and they will, in a sense, change either the vowels or the actual letters. We've learned this before, that letters come from 5 different places in the mouth, just physiologically, and letters within that same set, like if it's coming from the lips or it's coming from the teeth, you can exchange those letters to get a deeper meaning. So therefore, the sages would use this method where they would say, don't read this word this way, read it that way. And they would make a whole drasha out of it. Now, these are extremely creative, and it shows the sages' willingness, in a sense, to stretch the context of a word or a phrase or a verse in order to reveal deeper meanings. So that's what we're going to do tonight, is we're going to look at some of the examples of exactly what the sages did. So the first one is on page 205, those who want to follow. And this is, the sages ask, where do we know Haman from the Torah? They also ask, how do we know Mordechai from the Torah? And how do we know Esther from the Torah? So I believe last week we discussed where we find Esther using a different method, but they ask about all 3. Now, the surprising thing is that the story of Purim is happening approximately 900 years after the Torah is given. So even the question that the sages say, where do we find Haman and Mordechai and Esther in the Torah, is a surprising question. Why would you think they're in the Torah? But the premise is, the foundational idea is, everything is in the Torah. Everything that will ever happen is alluded to in the Torah. So tonight we're going to do, where do we see Haman in the Torah? So what they pick is going back to the Garden of Eden. And this is after Adam and Eve have eaten from the tree. And now they are hiding in the garden, thinking they can hide somehow from God. And so God says, Ayeka, where are you? Which of course we understand doesn't mean like, I can't find you. Where are you? It means, where are you holding? What have you done? And then it follows that God says, was it from the tree of good and evil that you ate? And so the words in Hebrew, from the tree, Hamin ha'etz. Hamin is the same letters, exact same letters as Haman. It just is different vowels. So the sages said, this is where we see Haman alluded to in the Torah. So of course, this is connecting Haman to the snake. In other words, that's the energy of Haman, is a snake-like energy. He tricks Adam and Eve into eating. And in a sense, Haman tricks Achashverosh into wanting to kill all of the Jews. But on a deeper level, so I'll just refer you, just because of a lack of time, for those who have my book, Seasons of the Soul. In the section about Purim, there's an entire article about the comparison of Purim to the whole incident that happened in the Garden of Eden. This is where Haman takes the role of the snake. Achashverosh takes the role of the negative side of Adam. Mordechai takes the place of the positive side of Adam. Vashti takes the negative side of Eve. And Esther takes the positive side of Eve. More than that, I won't explain, but if you have Seasons of the Soul, there is a whole explanation of how to read the story of Purim as if it's a replay of everything that happened in the Garden of Eden. So it's a very, very interesting idea. And for tonight, we'll just leave it that Haman is hinted to in the words Hamin Ha'etz, God confronting Adam and Chava, saying, from the tree that I told you not to eat from, you ate from. And that's where Haman comes in. Just another hint that we're told that on Purim, we're supposed to drink ad lo yada, until we don't know the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. And here we see, what is it? Also, if you have Seasons of the Soul, there's a whole article about what does it mean to drink till you don't know. It's not what a lot of people think it is, which is to get so drunk, you end up under the table and like out of it, like completely out of it. That's not exactly what the sages had in mind. But the hint here is they ate from the Eitz Hadat. They ate from the tree of knowledge. So what's the antidote? To get to the place of ad lo yada, where one doesn't know the difference. But that's a whole explanation that we can't get into right now. But as I'm thinking, for all of you who are on the WhatsApp, I guess what I'm going to do is I'm going to share these articles with you on the WhatsApp for those who don't have Seasons of the Soul. B'li neder. So that's our first example. The next example is a very, very well-known and quoted method. Again, don't read it this way, read it that way. So when the two tablets of the law are given to Moshe, so in the description of how the tablets were written with the finger of God, it says charut ala luchot, that the letters were engraved onto the tablets. So the sages say, don't read it charut, read it cherut. What is cherut? Freedom. So in other words, don't, obviously, I have to explain. When they say don't read it this way, read it that way, it doesn't mean that the original idea has no relevance. Of course it does. But what they're trying to point out, like, let's go deeper here. What does charut mean in a deeper sense? So the same letters of charut spell cherut. You just have to change the vowels. So in other words, you read it, freedom on the tablets. And of course, that it really connects to the Torah portions. Last week, we get out of Egypt and we're on our way to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah. In this week's Parsha, we receive the Torah. And so the purpose of coming out of Egypt was not only to get out of a state of slavery, which of course is very important, but it's only completed when it leads to Har Sinai and the type of freedom that the Torah gives us. Now, for many, many people who are looking at Judaism from the outside, so their question would be, freedom? Well, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't eat this. On Shabbos, there's like 500 things that you can't do. What kind of freedom are you talking about? The answer is freedom, number one, to do God's will. And the second thing is freedom from our lower animal nature. As long as we're ruled by our animal nature, we're not free. Whatever the superficial looks, what it looks like, you could take the most famous person, the richest person, the most successful person, but if they are still ruled by their lower nature, and there's no what's called tikkun midot happening, no attempt to rectify their character, then in our terminology, they're slaves. And where you can see this so often, it's almost on a daily level, where you can open the paper and you'll find some rich, famous, successful person caught up in some kind of scandal, either running after sex or running after drugs or running after power, and they do illegal things, illegal business things. You see it every day. This is what's called, in our terminology, someone who's not free. So when it says freedom on the tablets, so the sages are pointing out that the letters weren't just engraved, it's the highway to freedom. Okay, so the next one is on page 207. And this is in the last Torah portion, Zot HaBracha. And we know that Moshe was not allowed into Eretz Yisrael. And so God says, go up on the mountain and I will show you the land of Israel. And it mentions different places in Israel that God would show Moshe. And then it says, Ad Hayam Ha'acharon, until the last sea. So if we're reading it in a quite literal sense, it's talking about the Mediterranean. He's standing on a very tall mountain in what we now call Jordan. And God is showing him, whether it's physically or a vision of all of Eretz Yisrael, including the Mediterranean, the last sea, the final sea, the border of the western border of the land of Israel. So the sages again come and say, don't read it Yam Ha'acharon. The word for sea, body of water, is Yam. Read it Yom Ha'acharon. That God showed Moshe all of Jewish history until the last day. Yom Ha'acharon, until the last day. Now, there are other times in the Torah that we have allusions to God showing the patriarchs the future. When, if you remember, when God makes a covenant with Abraham, called the Covenant of the Pieces, Brit Bein HaBetarim. So it's in Parshat Lech Lecha. an incredible description of this covenant that God makes. And every part of it is highly symbolic. But when you look at Rashi, Rashi's interpreting, and almost everyone else, that the symbolic nature of this covenant is actually revealing to Abraham everything that will happen in the future to the Jewish people. We know that from the book of Devarim, even the literal meaning is God was showing the whole Jewish people what would happen if we listen to the voice of God, and what will happen if we don't listen to the voice of God. Yaakov, remember, he calls his sons together and says, I will reveal to you what will be in the end of days. And then we understand that it was closed off to him. Remember, we learned this a couple of weeks ago. It was closed off. Vayechi is a closed parsha. So this idea is also, of course, with the prophets, where God shows the prophets in a more immediate sense, especially with the destruction of the temples, that if the people would change their ways and create a just and fair society, the temples didn't need to be destroyed. But God showed them what would be if they didn't change their ways. So not only that, but of course in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets, we have one prophecy after the other for the Messianic era, and especially what's happening today. This is something that we've discussed a number of times, where the prophecies of all of our great prophets are being realized as we speak. And this is the wonder of being alive in this time. With all of the challenges that we have, we are seeing the prophecies of the prophets being realized. Now that's from 2,500 years ago and even farther back. So this idea here is mentioned again, that God is showing Moshe not the Yam Ha'acharon, but the Yom Ha'acharon. Okay, so now we mentioned Esther last week, where we see Esther. But now, I'm just looking where it is here. Okay, it's somewhere in the chat. Oh, here it is on page 207. Now, this one is a startling one, because the ones that we've given are deep allusions, but this one changes the whole meaning of a story. And so in the story of the Megillah, so it says that Esther was adopted as a daughter by Mordechai. Her parents had passed away, and her uncle, Mordechai, adopted her. And in the text, it says that he adopted her as a daughter. So Rabbi Meir comes and says a startling thing. He says, don't read it. In Hebrew, the word for daughter is bat. The word for wife in Hebrew, the allusion is bayit, home. In other words, all throughout the Talmud and the Midrash, a woman is called, when they're married, a man's home is bayit. So Rebbe Meir says, don't read it daughter, read it bayit, meaning that Esther was not only adopted as his daughter, but they actually married. Now, this interpretation adds a whole different layer to the entire story. The whole story. And you should know in Jewish law, it's not done very often, but a uncle is allowed to marry his niece, and vice versa, of course. A nephew is not allowed to marry his aunt. So we have one case of that, a very important case, is Amram was the nephew of Yocheved. From there comes Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. That's a whole paradoxical idea in of itself. But if you can imagine, it's very, very different to read the relationship between Mordechai and Esther if she is his daughter, adopted daughter, or if she is his wife. And so therefore, according to this drasha, now the sages, they're not just throwing out wild ideas here. The assumption is that there was an oral tradition that this is what happened, and that it just wasn't advertised, put it that way. It was, in a sense, below the surface. But Rabbi Meir wasn't just like throwing out like a cute little drasha here. I'm assuming that there was an oral tradition that he based his drasha on. So again, when it comes to the Megillah, again, for those who have seasoned the soul, I'm sure that I discussed this at length, this different reading of the story. Now we have another interesting one, and that is on page 208. So in the second passage of the Shema, the first passage of the Shema, so we say, V'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam. You shall teach them to your children and discourse in them, discuss it with them. So the word for you shall teach them is v'shinantam. So the sages, now up to now, in a sense, we're here in the last one, by it, we added a letter to what it says in the text. The other ones were changing the vowels. This one also, but it's more of a really different kind of reading. So the sages said, don't read it v'shinantam, read it v'shilashtem, which is really a change in the word, v'shilashtem. What does this word mean? It comes from the word shalosh. Shalosh, of course, means three. And so the sages say something very, very interesting. It says that a person should divide their learning into three parts. One part should be the 5 books of Moses. The second should be the Mishnah. And the third part should be Talmud. So there are two opinions in the Gemara. One says that this is referring to a person's whole life, that all the learning that a person does should be split into 3, into learning the Torah, learning the Mishnah, and learning the Talmud. Another opinion is it's not just your whole life. Every day, a person should divide their learning per day into learning the Chumash, the Mishnah, and the Gemara. So what's interesting is that hardly anyone does this. Almost every yeshiva, once you get to the older ages, now if we're talking about younger ages, so they are learning Chumash, learning a little bit of halacha, being introduced to Mishnah, being introduced to Talmud. But once students get a little bit older, over, I'll say, generations at this point, almost all of the emphasis is put on learning Talmud. So it's just, I'm not coming to say what's right or what's wrong. I'm just pointing out, I know many people question this idea that so much emphasis is put on Talmud. Now anyone who questions that is not in any way denigrating learning Talmud. Chas v'shalom, God forbid. But many people do point out that there's a lot to learn in Torah. There's a lot to concentrate, and that different attempts at different times, even today, in many different schools, high schools, junior highs, more advanced yeshiva, especially for Baal Tshuva, are not exactly all Gemara. So please don't anyone misunderstand me, that I'm not saying that learning Gemara is not a good thing, but I'm just pointing out that right here for the sages themselves were encouraging people to, in a sense, be more well-rounded in their learning. Okay, now we're going to end with one last one, because for those who came in late, we're only learning about a half an hour, 70 faces, and then we're going to go to Tu B'Shvat. So the last one is one that I like very much on page 212. This is something that we say every day. Ein tsur ke'Elokeinu. At the very end of davening, we say there's no, tsur means rock. It's the same root, though, as the word to form. So some read it, there's no rock like our God, meaning there's no one you can depend on other than God. God is like the rock of Gibraltar, kaviyachol, not exactly, but the way we use it in modern terminology, if you want to say something is very strong, we'll say like the rock of Gibraltar. Obviously, God is more than that. But the other meaning, there's no one who can form like God. And so the Gemara says that God is not like a human being, that a human being can make a shape. And the example that they give is a shape on a wall. Could draw a picture of a shape. In our day, so we create all kinds of things, but then it says, but God is not like that. He can not only form something, but he can breathe life into it and give it life. But the drasha that we want to get to is a further drasha, which I just love. Every day when I say it, this is what I think of. The same word tsur is sayar, a painter, an artist. In modern Hebrew, these are the words for a painter or an artist. It's sayar. So the Gemara itself says, don't read it tsur, read it sayar, meaning there's no artist like God. And so, of course, when we look at the natural world and we see, and that's a great lead in to what we'll be learning in another minute of Tu B'Shvat, because Tu B'Shvat has become really the day to celebrate, acknowledge, and praise the land of Israel, the seven fruits of Israel, but in a broader sense, the whole natural world that God has created. This incredibly diverse, beautiful, colorful, inspirational world. Ein sayar ke'Elokeinu. There's no artist like our God. So every day when I say it, that's what I think of. And it's based on this method. That's what we were learning tonight. A certain method that the sages used hundreds of times throughout the Gemara. Don't read it this way, read it that way. So I'm going to end this part of our learning tonight with a blessing that really what the sages were teaching was always look deeper than the surface. Don't just read reality the way it appears. Look a little bit deeper and you'll find more meaning there. So we should all be blessed to have this desire to embrace the Torah and embrace life a little bit deeper.